I'd just like to take a minute to share a few of my personal memories of George Harrison, a few of many. It's a man I got to know. I guess I remember his extraordinary generosity. Anybody who ever had a meal with George knew that you couldn't pick up that bill unless you went behind his back. And I know that George paid for and mailed at his own expense, I don't know how many copies of Saoirse. I was one of the many who got a copy of Saoirse regularly, thanks to George. But, you know, George also, in his own unassuming way, because I remember there was a discussion in the New York Gates Block Mall Committee. Some people said we should be aiding the families of Irish National Liberation Army prisoners, which we did not do. But George just quietly said that he didn't see any need for that. He'd been sending money to the relatives of Irish Republicans for many years, just on his own. And I'm sure that there are people all over Ireland who can tell you the story that a check just arrived in the mail one day from George Harrison in Brooklyn, New York. They didn't know him, never met him, but he knew them. He knew they were the families of Irish Republicans and they needed help. Another thing I just always remember about George, I think George was the most thoroughgoing anti-imperialist I ever met in my life. And, you know, the African National Congress honored George. It's, you know, we heard earlier that David Ndaba, the secretary to the ANC mission to the United Nations, testified at George's trial. And David told me that wasn't a decision they made lightly. That was an organizational decision by the ANC that they would testify for George. And because they held him in such high regard. And, you know, when South Africa was finally free, the ANC invited George and a number of others to be their honored guest at the new free South African mission to the United Nations, where George had stood outside for so many years picketing. So that was part of George. Of course, we all know that George and Pat Mullins and Tom Falvey and Danny Gormley aided and armed the Irish Republican Army. George for 25 years. What we sometimes forget is they were very good at it, you know? They got, George estimated conservatively, they got 3,000 weapons and 1 million rounds of ammunition over there. And they lasted for 25 years. And then some geniuses in Belfast decided that they needed to run the show. They needed to appoint their own people to do it. They knew much better than George. Well, if you read Peter Taylor's book, Behind the Mask, that operation lasted probably less than 25 months, where George had gone for 25 years. Those people might have learned something from George Harrison. They might have learned something not just about gun running, they might also have learned something about principle. Because George was all about principle. And I think they abandoned principle. So I'll close by remembering George's old friend and comrade Tom Falvey. And you can't talk about George without at least mentioning Tom. And George loved to tell the story that on the picket line at the British consulate, people he described as newcomers, he probably used more colorful language than that, would tell Tom, you ought to be doing this, that, or the other thing. And Tom would just say, I have other assignments. And we all know now what those assignments were. But, you know, I think each of us should take our own assignments, whatever they are, big or small, for Irish freedom, and just try to do them as well and as thoroughly and as competently as George Harrison, Tom Falvey, Pat Mullins, Tommy Gormley, and Michael Flannery did. And